measuring success. They might look at you and say, hey, we just want to bring in some new information. We don't understand what you're doing, but we're going down a path that says we need to figure out some things that we don't understand.
Dude, I feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
And that might be their measuring stick for success might be we have new information that we can lean on or that we can try out. If they're like, yeah, if we bring you in, we need our batting average across the minor league system to go up by 10 points. And if you don't do that, then it's a failure.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's kind of it's a weird way to say it.
For sure.
And yeah, it's funny because I don't even know what the full perspective is anymore on somebody like you or somebody on Twitter the other day was like, oh, the league knows this. The league knows that this move doesn't work. I'm like, dude, I was on the team. I've been on phone calls with major league organizations, multiple teams in the last 2 days. So what does the league know? I don't understand what you're trying to like flex on me that you think you talk to somebody that works for a team. I'm like, yeah, I talk to people too. What are we talking about? You're not competing on the right stage right now.
Well, I think that's I brought that up the other day when someone said, like in general, people might, let's say it's like a minor league coach or something like that. And they're like, oh, well, they, coach for the Cardinals or something like that. And it's like the general public not understanding. It's like, yeah, but like the conversations, again, that you and I are having with these organizations, like, yeah, I mean, I talk to individual like hitting coaches and things like that as well. But like more often as well, it's like overall, like overarching philosophy and like understanding with all these constraints, like the best you can do in like all these areas. But also with that as well, it's an interesting perspective from that other side is like you're saying is like it's there's actually a name for it where like from psychology where they use somebody else's credibility as their credibility because they're saying, hey, somebody with credibility agrees with me, so I am therefore credible. It's a natural thing that we all do where again we'll name drop X, Y, and Z and like, oh, I was talking with this person, oh well, whatever that is. And that's why the Tigers can't hit, or like they'll, this is exactly why old school blah blah. That's why batting averages are so low. It's just like okay, all these things. But again, I think along with it, when you're better at identifying like some of these lower level thoughts that are, it's pretty like it's simple. Like, and I think it's a devaluing of one, maybe some, and we're all. In some way, in the same way, or like we might be like arrogant information, being like fixing these problems and like thinking that we know from like outside what the problems are. But then also too, in the same way, it's like if it was such an easy fix, you're thinking that the only smart one here that's seeing all of this is you. It's like a scary place to be in. And then two, on the other side.
And also, why aren't you already hired? If you have the answer, then
yeah.
Somebody should hire you to.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think it's the same thing too, as well. It's just like, okay, for example, and also too, I mean, I get it. Like you might have the answer, but again, along with it, like you need to prove it. There is some like, okay, is it n equals 1? Like, I'm saying, okay, like is it really true? Like you might do your philosophy. Maybe it's swing down, or maybe it's, something simple like that. Maybe it's, every 8th bat you should drop a bunt just to spread out the defense or something like whatever your philosophy, like some random philosophy. I mean, one time, this will be a funny story for you, is at 108 this old guy rolled up one day, middle of the day, some random dude.
Like he showed up in person?
Yeah, he's like 75 years old at least.
Awesome.
He might be in his 80s. He rolls up, can barely get out of the car. Like I helped him get out of the car. He's driving this old Cadillac, like it was like burgundy or something like that, right? He gets out, doesn't really say much to us, like, oh, hey. And he's like, hey. And he like doesn't really make eye contact with us. Straight walks to like his trunk. And this is like a roll up door. Like we got a roll up door like ours, like, and the door was open. He just rolls up in front of the door and just starts walking to his trunk. So here we are. right? Like, I'm like, well, maybe he's gonna take us all out. Let's just see what's going on. So he pops his trunk and he's just got baseball stuff in his trunk and pulls out a bat that's like a big 5 like wood bat, you know. I don't know if you know Big 5 Sporting Goods. I don't know how big it is on the East Coast. Anyways,
No.
like it's like, you know, anyways, it's not a good bat. It's just like old like wood bat. And he's just like starts talking to us like, I got this hitting thing that you know nobody understands this and blah blah blah. And so I'm like, you know, I'm like ears open, like, cool. You want to tell me something? Like, see what you got. You know, like he doesn't know who like 108 is or anything. So he actually went to there's like a sporting good place like down the street, like on the end of our thing. And he just like rolled up to us and like wanted to train players at our facility, like wanted to rent, like this was his main thing. So I'm like, okay, well, like show me your philosophy, like break it down for me, like what you got, you know? So he gets all those back. He takes the bat and he just like lays it flat like this. And he's just like, the pitch is coming in like this. And everybody's bats are like this. And then they're swinging, barrels dropping, everybody's underneath, all those things. Like, you need to lay it flat, like perfectly flat, and just
Love it.
pull it through, right? And we start talking about, you know, some of those things, and I'm like, you know, he's like, they just don't understand if you just laid it flat and blah blah, how much more success like everybody would have, and all these things. And that was like the root of like his thing is just like match playing basically, and then like just pull it through and like you'd make way more contact. And so it's just funny, but he was just like, and then we had, you know, I had to have the, like in his head, he's like, I'm going to train here. Like, I'm going to train people here. I'm going to train like, he's like,
He figured it out.
he literally said,
Yeah.
he literally said like, when is your next pro guy? Like, when is your next professional athlete like coming in? Like, I'll show you, I'll work with him. And I'm like, oh, okay, well that, you know, and then we had to have some tough combos, you know?
Talk about it's a low feel.
Yeah. He
I-
was like, I'll show you, like, watch, like, and watch how, and again, had never, and I'm like, okay, well, what guys have you, you know, worked with? Like, you know, I start like probing him with some of these questions. And he's just like, well, I had, you know, my nephew, he batted whatever in his league and he hits like this and blah, blah, blah. And I taught him everything. It was just like, oh, okay. Like, you know, but again, the one thing, again, root from that story is like, as well as like someone that passionately loved baseball. Like he really did passionately love baseball. And, you know, he even pulled out, I think I had the piece of paper. I had it for a long time where he like drew on the piece of paper and he was like, see the picture, like he like gave me a illustration of what he was explaining. And,
Yeah.
but like, yeah, can barely walk, like was like, you know, he had a cane, like the whole thing. And, it was just an interesting thing. The same thing of just like dynamic of what that process was. Like,
Love it.
It was an interesting piece.
I was when people always I love using the example of a bunt as the shortest swing.
Yeah.
So like on the scale of like bunt to like Javi Baez.
Yeah.
Javi Baez has
Yeah.
got the longest swing.
For sure.
Like somewhere in the middle is where you want to be.
You didn't know that he struck out a lot because he kicks back?
Oh.
Yeah, just so you know.
It
I gotta.
there's also
there's
there's also the metric that he chased like 100 more sliders in the dirt than
Yeah,
everybody
yeah.
else.
Well, he also has to commit 20 minutes earlier than everybody else.
Yeah.
When you have your bat pointing, you know, and it's smaller than it used to be. It used to be even bigger.
It's big and it's late.
Yeah, 100%. And that's
So-
where like, but somebody was like, "You also strikes out." I'm like, okay, like that's
But if you start at the bunt, right? You start at a bunt, that's the shortest swing.
Yeah.
Can you hit the ball effectively with a bunt?
what does effectively mean?
Can you hit a line drive in the gap with a bunt?
No,
Not gonna happen.
Yeah.
So if you go from like a bunt,
but
to
you
the
can hit
biggest
a
swing-
double. You can hit a double like Cano did.
Sure. Yeah. But
Right.
was he just holding it there, or did he kind of?
They shifted on him.
Yeah.
he-
But he kind of like
he-
it was like a little
Yeah, he was
splash.
like,
yeah.
kind of.
So that was a bigger swing.
Ball.
So that was a longer swing.
little
So
bit
a
longer
bunt would be the
in
bat
between those.
bat stationary versus
Yeah.
a little push bunt.
You also got like the little catch.
Little give. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at some point there nedes to be speed created.
Who would have thought we would start talking about bunting, me and you on the thing? It's classic.
Well, no, it's just it's just an analogy.
I know. Keep going.
But-
I'm just gonna snip this part and just say we had the whole conversation was about bunting.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm just gonna
I think I just burped into the mic too. So
That's okay.
make sure you leave that in
We'll be
there
all right.
when I
Leave all-
when you edit it.
We're real here.
But if you start at a bunt and you go to like the biggest, longest men's slow pitch softball, whatever, they're just
It's probably that swing where the guy actually swings. It goes behind his back and then he hits. You've seen the softball guy that
I
does
have
that?
seen that.
That's
Yeah.
probably the longest swing you can get, huh?
I actually think that's a short swing.
Okay. Well, I
But
guess,
that's
you know.
it's very deep.
But if you go by initiation of swing, like blast metric, it would measure it as long. Time to contact would be long.
Yeah,
You'd have to start
Maybe.
really early.
I don't know. It's a deep swing.
It's a deep
It's a
swing.
deep swing.
For
But
sure.
it's just like you can zoom in and zoom out on detail.
Yeah.
To the whatever, like everything always points back to the athlete that somebody needs to get in the batter's box and hit.
Mhm.
They need to get in the batter's box, feel like they have a clue what they're doing, have something repeatable that they can hold on to. And I feel like like major league hitters, the guys that hit 260, 270 and have a job for 10 years, they figured out how to play at that level. And I use the analogy of video games.
Mhm.
And like level 1 is like Little League, 12U. Like you got to be able to beat level 1 to get to level 2.
Mhm.
And every level you move up, there's a new boss. There's a new like
Yep.
Bowser. Bowser just would like charge you, and,
100%.
like try to get you. And then next level, Bowser's got this hammer that he throws at you.
Yeah.
And you got to figure out how to jump. And
Then
you gotta-
he could jump.
and then he could, yeah.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
you go through these different levels, and the thing that makes you successful at level 4 is a piece of level 5, but you need to learn something new for level 5.
Yeah.
So when this whole thing of like perfect mechanics, how many truly elite hitters have existed in the history of the game?
Very little. Yeah.
And what actually separates
What-
Miguel Cabrera from somebody else? Like, what is the
Well,
thing?
and what is elite? I mean, obviously too. From
Yeah.
the get-go. Right. I mean, as a
But
Hall of Fame, I mean, you can mark it as like Hall of Fame, maybe.
Only a certain fraction of the league is an all-star every year.
Yeah.
And it's a very small fraction.
For sure. And we've
So-
also coined, like, I was thinking about, to your point there as well. I was thinking about this the other day about like, we're like, oh, 300, he's a good hitter. And it's like, you know, when people really bat 300, like, especially nowadays, like, it's just, you know, one, it's not necessarily most of the goals. And I think in a lot of ways, I mean, it's not that people want less hits, but, you know, necessarily it's less than it was before of like average being so important. But like you were saying as well, I really thought about that the other day as just being like, what we in my head of like a standard of like what a good hitter is like a great phenomenal hitter, you know, at this point, like especially within the game where it's like, you know, and again, obviously that's not the only metric. Again, we talked about like, you know, OPS and so many other things you can measure by, but I just thought that was interesting is like I started realizing that even me, what my standard of what a good hitter in the big leagues
Mhm.
was like an elite hitter in the big leagues, you know.
But you get the guy that hits 260 and hangs around for 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
They've figured out what they need to do to be successful at that level.
Yeah.
And their level of success may not be the all-star level player.
Yeah.
But at the major league level, they need, if you can perform at 260, 270 and the league knows that and the team that pays you knows that, the value of that versus bringing in a minor league guy
Yep.
that might hit 220, that it's known commodity versus unknown commodity.
Yeah.
And the things that player needs to do to hit 260, 270, the pitches that they know they can hit and what they can't hit, they know how to play against certain bosses. And when you're in the league for a while, you know how you're going to get pitched. You know how they're trying to get you out.
Yeah.
So your strategy, their whole mental game and approach is so different because they're playing the same players every single day, and they've figured out what they need to look for and what they need to do to be successful. That has nothing to do with swing mechanics. And if you change their mechanics, that's really
change the
risky
game.
for them. That's really risky for them. So I used to always be like, "Oh, well, this guy's swing is terrible. Why wouldn't he be all over this?" It's like, well, he's making $4 million a year, and you're potentially taking that away from him.
Yeah.
You're a risk, not an
For sure.
opportunity. And I think most people don't see it that way. And
No,
it's a different perspective because it's a job, and there's a minimum level of production that they are comfortable with, that they need to be able to achieve a certain amount of success.
My question would be with you also contextually playing devil's advocate on the other side of that. Let's say you take somebody like Mookie Betts, all-star, all the thing. He made a pretty big swing change,
You're gonna go
right? He made a pretty big swing change, like that. He was already like, I mean, again, to most people's eyes, he's elite, right? Already,
Mhm.
right? Now, along with that, he made some pretty big swing changes of what he's done. You know, again, like he was more of like a roll guy up top. Now he's like more like, you know, stick, like, you know, almost again limited role, I guess you would say, if you can say it from that sense. Some bigger changes that he's made from there. Is it risky? For sure, but also too, for example, like cutting your chest open and performing heart surgery is risky, but at the same time necessary in certain situations. And also for an elite performer, you know, like let's say, for example, like I remember when like my hand, for example, when I broke my hand in a small town, they just put me in a little splint, put my hand back together and let it heal at like 39 degrees. Like no big deal, right? Because it wasn't worth them cutting open my hand because the risk that they had on the opposite side with like infection, how they would actually do it, like how they weren't hand specialists. They were like a town of like 2,500 people. Like these don't really perform them like that very often and all those things. But then again, every time, like immediately, as soon as I dove back into a bag, like my hand would immediately swell up and it's like, it wasn't going to work. So I come see a hand specialist here in Vegas and he's like, dude, we're having surgery tomorrow. Like I have to re-break your hand and putting a rod through the back of your hand. Like he does all these other things and performs the surgery. So it's like also risky to who, where it's like, if I can take Humpty Dumpty back apart and put him back together again, like for example, like if you were going to change a guy's swing, it's less risky for you than it is for maybe someone that's like a high school, like second year coaching. Maybe he's only done little league, he's only volunteered, all these other things. Like, hey, if you start changing things, it's like there's still risk. There's always risk, no matter what we do. There's also a risk of not changing anything, right? Where like, and that's what I was going to ask you as well. Contextually, like you take a guy like Mookie, where the league's going to start to adapt over the years, right? Where like, you know, for example, you take somebody like Jose Bautista, right? And I know that obviously you've got some more in this obviously there, but it's like, you know, he ended up having so many injuries like in a short time frame. It's like, okay, well, how he used to hit also is going to lead to him some other ways where like, you know, he can't hit that way no longer anymore. So at what point do you also weigh that where it's a sense of like, well, he bats 250 in the big leagues and we're going to leave him alone, right? Comparatively to, you know, what is success there, right? And also, do we just leave everybody alone? You know, they've all learned to compete and get to a 1%, less than 1% level, and they're all elite in that way, and we should just shouldn't touch anybody. You know, what is the
Well, I would say most of the guys that are hitting 260, they want to be hitting 300.
100%?
It's not that they don't want to.
Yeah.
It's so competitive,
Yeah.
and they're fighting for survival to an extent. So much of it's mindset. So much of it is believing in yourself and taking the risk. Most of the guys that I know that have made that transformation from maybe, I wouldn't even say fringe big leaguer, but they're there, but they're not doing it. And most of them they just take extreme accountability for their careers. That's the biggest separator. Is they say, I'm selling out to something, I'm going for it. If I go down, it's on my terms. So I'm all in. And once they make that commitment, it frees them up. And if they fail, they fail, but at least they know.
I got a tough one. I got a tough question for you. Segue. What is something you passionately believed 6 years ago that you disagree with now?
I don't.
Is there anything that you were like? Is there anything where you're like, yeah, I was wrong about that, or I see it from a very different lens than I did?
I don't think so. Because again, most of what I'm doing is just observing and trying to understand what created success.
Yeah.
So if I watch Poole swing, like his moves are his moves, and I've always looked at the swing through how the bat's moving, because the bat can't move unless your hands are on the bat, unless your body's creating a bat path.
Do you think it's better now?
Is what better now?
His swing this year?
Did you see the article that the adjustments he made at the second half? I think he's older now, and he needs the leg lift to get himself going, and that's great. He had an amazing second half.
He did.
There's been issues with his feet. There's when he was playing in Los Angeles, his body was broken down.
Yeah. Well, he was also like, I don't know. I'm sure. I know he's like one of your faves, but like obviously when he was also struggling too. Like I remember I sent over Donnie Ecker at one point. I was like, "What do you got on that lower half?" Like he's like pinning his knees. Like he at one point was like super pinning his knees, like into like his adductors were just groin heavy, like along with it. And I know he's having some issues and things there, but now he's back wider again. Which again, though,
but was that his feet that was causing him to do that? What? A guy like him, he's had success. To sustain that type of success is really hard.
Yeah.
And if something breaks, like your foot starts to hurt and you can't load the way that you've needed to load, he's leaning into stuff. Like he's always had the back knee tucked,
Yeah.
but then he started doing like the front knee a little bit too.
Yeah.
And it was, you lose stuff, you gain stuff. And
Well, I also think you start to, this is the other part, you go a little higher, usually the same thing as well. Like start having knee problems, all those other things. Anytime somebody has knee or like lower back problems, I immediately, and generally, and just in general, I'm like, there's something going on with the pelvis. Like there's something going on with the pelvis where, again, it's usually affecting the stable joint above or below. And like, for example, most people that have knee problems, like there's a massive pelvis deficiency. And like there's too much range of motion that's happening in the knee, like laterally or in some, way where like there's not enough pelvic stability. And then a guy like him that also is pinning his knees in. Not saying that nothing happened with his feet or any of those other things as well, that comes into it. But a lot of times, even too, it could go down the chain, right? Where all of a sudden now your feet anatomy actually starts changing. All this thing starts adapting to, like human tissue not having free will. Like it has to change to demand and what you're asking it to do. But also too, when a guy is like really pinned like that, or anytime I have a guy that's like really pinned into like his adductor there, a lot of times, like it or not, most likely that glute in the back is going to be inhibited, like because again, you're compensating into the other, pelvic stability, where like a lot of guys are like when they're way too one way or another, or again, for a guy that's like super external, like a lot of times his adductors, those things start to get inhibited. But like, I just think on the same thing, like the reason I was like bringing that up as well is that, again, he's a guy that changed his swing multiple times, especially in recent years, throughout his career, where it's like, again, going back to that original thing that we talked about, it was like,
but when Albert would take BP, he would always do his normal machine, like wide stance, whatever.
mm-hmm.
His last round, he would always do a big leg kick.
Mm-hmm.
This was like back in 20.
Yeah.
I worked with a guy with the Cardinals back in 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
And he would talk about like every final round of the day, he would like,
you used to have your clips. Because you used to have a lot of BP clips from, when you'd go out, and I remember having a lot of Albert clips and this stuff.
Yeah. So
the leg was like your dude, so like he's like your Mount Rushmore guy. So I know that was like a guy that you paid a lot of close attention to. Kind of like I do with like JD and those other guys. Yeah.
Yeah. So the leg kick wasn't like this brand new out of nowhere type move.
Yeah.
It was him trying to find something.
Yeah.
And that line between success and failure is so thin.
Yeah.
And he's losing speed. His legs are bright. He's pinning his knees. He's trying to find something.
Yeah.
And with the Cardinals this year, we've talked about it on the Peltero Pickle. It just looks like he's having fun. Or the second half.
Yeah.
We also heard stories that he was considering shutting it down at the All-Star break.
Yep.
That he was gonna stop. He was gonna retire at the break.
Wow.
And that some of the guys there convinced him not to. So to be back in St. Louis, which probably felt like home.
Yeah.
Beginning of the season
with his family
issues.
Well, and
we had family issues that were getting sorted out beginning of the year. It's a lot of the final year.
Yeah.
That's a lot going on.
For sure.
And I think the casual fan forgets that they're people and that, how are you doing at work if you've got stuff going on at home? You got a sick family member or something that's going on. It's going to distract you.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to play a game at that speed and you're distracted, it's hard. It's really hard.
I have another challenge for you. So I was thinking this. Obviously, we've been talking about so many different ways of like communication and all these other things, and we've talked about it in the same thing that there's things that obviously, we've disagreed about on the same thing of like, training wise and X, Y, and Z. But I also think one of the things I talked about in the previous podcast, I know that you listened to, it's funny because I walked in my office and I was clicking through my tabs before I came out here, and I had it pulled up on your guys' YouTube because I was watching some of your guys' stuff, especially because you guys did that Judge podcast the other day, and I was listening through some of that, which I still haven't finished, by the way. But in any case, I do think, one, I think it would be interesting also for a viewer. Two, also example of like bigger things of like happening in the game. One of the things I was going to bring up is I think we should talk about things we disagree about. And I think, again, it would be productive in that same sense. And I was like, so one of the things I was going to bring up, I wanted you to kind of, open up as well is, for example, you've talked about for a long time, especially when it comes to like timing along with it. I think you've been a guy that's been accused of bigger moves. Let that be a leg kick. Let that be a bat tip.
Yeah.
Let that be movement. Like you really like flow, like a lot of those different things as well. And I've had a lot of guys where I've had to use, and I'm happy I've had that in my bank because I've had to actually use with a lot of guys in that same way. Um, Also, too, I know historically, even me and you started to talk about it last night, is you don't like a lot of presets, like where you take a lot of movement out of it, and it's very, and again, along with it, I was more leaning, again, obviously, again, coming up like from all the stuff I've consumed from you, I was very movement, like a lot of movement, in the sense of like athletically flow, all those other things. When I got to 108, Eugene had a different, a lot different philosophy, and I saw a lot of value in like obviously how he's doing things as well. But I wanted to bring that back up, with you, because one of the things that you used to talk about a lot back in the day, and also one of the big things is like, we get into your gather, we get into the crunch move, we get into like, timing of lower half to upper half and then syncing with each other. Sometimes, again, I pointed out multiple times, like, like elbow to knee, like where Donaldson like literally like hits his elbow, before he comes back within like timing. There's like ball drop drills. There's so many different things. Again, I know Vensoyok does like a ball drop drill that's like very like that, with like timing the hands of like coming back and what that looks like, as well. Why don't you kind of talk through, I know that again, that's more with flow, like why that has been so like big for you and why you feel like that is so important in the swing comparison to some of the things of, I know a lot of people also utilize, including me, in the same way of like a preset or pre-stretch or all those other things where you're not, there isn't that movement there. And why don't you kind of open that up slightly?
I think my lens from what I was taught when I was younger
Mm.
influenced a lot of that. And when I was talking about this stuff, 2009, 2010, I mean, I grew up with the foot down early, hands back.
Yep.
Like literally load, stop by the time the ball's released.
Yep.
So if you come from a lens of my entire life, go through high school, college, into some and low level pro ball, but this is like my whole career.
Yeah.
I'm being told load, stop.
That's how I was too.
Load, stop,
Agreed.
load, stop. And then I pull up a video and the best hitters on the planet have their hands at the lowest point and their leg in the air at pitch release. The exact opposite of what I've been taught.
Yep.
Blows up your whole reality of what hitting is. So
yeah.
In general, I mean, there's kids that come in that are super lax and they need stability. And I would do more stability based and preset or minimize the movements. But for the most part, kids I was dealing with needed movement. They needed to understand when to move as much as how to move. So like the go drills that were in my book, like it's funny because I don't know if people assume that I do all those drills with every single player, but like those would come out on occasion, but they're just constraint drills to try to get kids to be in a position like the halfway home drill, like keep your bat vertical until the ball's halfway to home plate. Because if you do that, you've got a chance to create movement with your body.
Yeah. Delaying the hands.
Yeah. Without almost every kid, they'd pull their hands back and then stop, pull their hands back, stop. So the movement for me was,
I got to be ready to swing at pitch release though.
Maybe, maybe not. But it's the hitters that are standing in front of me. These are the things that they're showing me consistently. And to me, it's the movement. There's one book, I forget what it's called right now, but it was some mixed martial art thing. And he would talk about making the circle smaller. Art of learning. Yeah. So make the circle smaller.
You recommended it to me and I read it. So
yeah, I read that's 10 years ago for me.
100%. I was going to bring it up. And I'm happy you did. Yeah. But good. I figured that you were going to bring it up.
Yeah. So if you start with the move that's big, you can condense it and make it smaller. And if you understand the move, you can make it as big as you want or as small as you want.
Well, and it's simplicity before, again, like that everybody's experience and exaggeration.
But that's why I like Poole so much, because his moves are so structured. Like he creates the geometry of the body, which is a phrase I've always loved. The geometry of his body is so clear and obvious. So that's why I like using him as an example, because it's simple, which is funny because I'm a big movement guy, and the guy I love the most is Poole, who's not a big movement guy. So if you understand the positioning that you're trying to achieve,
he's got a bigger move now.
Yeah, but
back in the day, he was wide, and
he was the example of get the foot down, and then he would like start the bat angled back. which if at the time there were no side views available, so you didn't know that he started back, and then
Yeah, and it
he
would
would tip and it would come forward.
or like Bryant. A lot of people like I posted a video about hinging instead of squatting one day, and they're like, "Well, tell that to Chris Bryant." And I'm like, "Bro, he starts on his knees. Watch his first move, like hips pop back, and he boom goes into it. Like it's like that's where just where he starts, and then like as
Yeah.
soon as he does his forward move, he gets back in this other position. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of guys do that. They'll sit in a squat, and then right as the move happens, like they'll come up and out or
Yeah.
into that more thing.
So yeah, so in general, one of the bigger mistakes I see is kids, they load statically too early,
Mm,
and I want the whole thing to be flow. I want the
Yeah.
whole thing to be rhythm.
Yeah.
So bigger moves help promote that.
Yeah.
And if I've got a kid in the cage, we're gonna progress from big moves to small moves. We're gonna go really big moves with no moving ball,
Yeah.
with the moving ball, and then we're gonna try to condense it, and I'm gonna challenge you.
mm,
It's not like every single kid I'm gonna have doing a Mel Ott drill
Yeah.
where he's literally bringing the bat down to his knee.
Yeah. We used
But
to do that.
but
I
I'll
would
do
even-
that.
I would even have guys like tap the knob of the bat on their front knee and then
Yeah.
work it back.
Yeah.
We used to do that a lot. And the thing is actually interesting. And the reason I brought this up is it's contrary to a lot of skill acquisition science, but I know that it works. Like you're saying, like again, I've seen that work so much. And again, it's more on like the martial arts, which is like practical rather than, and you still take in pieces, obviously, that is in the sense of you're taking away other variables so that they can be variable, where they could move and do these things. Where again, we might go back to the T or whatever that is, right? But also, too, for example, Eugene was more kind of like traditional skill acquisition, which was like you move less, right? Like you move less. How little can I move with how much can I produce? And also taking away a lot of like momentum, like where again, I'm not using a lot of momentum. And it's not that you're he was anti momentum or any of those things. But again, along with it, it was like, how much force can I create in very small windows with like the smallest move possible? And the more I move, the more, timing variables that I have like along with it, which again, I think there's some truth to all of those pieces. But I say in general, like with me, one of the things I talk about is like creating like an attractor. Like there's a reason why when we take every hitter, right, and we get to your 50-50 or whatever you want to call that, your launch position, all these other things, there's a reason why every really good hitter, like they get to a small variation of that spot, right? Like, so Randy might, Sullivan might mark that as like an attractor, like, where I want to, get to or through or however you want to describe it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But also along with it, one of the things that I talk about, guys, like when I go to train guys, one of the main things, like, and that's why you'll see a lot of my videos, and you've brought this up to me a lot and being like, because I post a lot of constraint post, which gets me a lot of different, again, because it's a very different philosophy than a lot of people do, where like most people just post full swings. Pro hitter could hit the, 90% of their time in constraints. Someone's going to post their full swing of them hitting a ball 110 and you see them in BP. And that's what they did. For example, like you'll watch, I wrote about that article, like that they wrote on Donnie when he was in San Francisco, and they're like, oh, all this challenging machine work and all these other things. And I'm like, did you guys go down in the cage? Like you guys saw his field BP and you said like, that's 100%. This is how it is. All these things, like you didn't see any of the constraints that he did down in the cage. You don't see any things he does in the weight room. You have no idea, again, all the patterning work and all the things that he does before he ever. And then also too, you call it high velo machine and the machine's shooting at 75 or 80 miles an hour, or with an unmatched, like they're more creating angles than they are like overmatching them with speed, or like it's not a 95, 98 mile an hour fastball. And most of the time, Donnie's using it as a breaking ball. Like it's most of the time when he's doing things. And like, I've seen him go through that process. So I also think it's interesting when, again, like the misinformation there, where it's like, he's just firing balls. Like, no, that's not what one of the best hitting.
Self-organized.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just letting those guys hit and go, oh yeah, we're just going to see sliders from this angle. And that being, it's almost like, for me, it's like, and again, I'll also too, as intellectual and also like friend of Donnie, like it's almost like a reductionist view on like how good of a coach like he is like when they reduce it down to the simplicity of, oh, they just fire balls from the same angles with the same spin, with the same this, and that's why his guys can hit. It's just like, no. And also on top of that, I think it just sends the wrong message for so many coaches and runs them. Again, imagine if you go to that stop and someone sent you with the 10 different options of where you can go and someone sent you down the wrong road. and said it was the right road and made you believe it was the right road. And then you keep banging your head against the wall being like, I just must be an idiot because, like this isn't working. And again, along with that, and that's why you got to be careful also with what people say compared to what they do and like that mix between of all of that. But, for example, one of the main things philosophy for me is you'll see me post a lot of guys from launch. And one of the things reason I go with a lot of guys from launch is one, most people, when you get from an anatomy perspective and you understand everything the body has to do during the stride, like you have your entire anatomy on one leg while it's going through multiple planes of motion, all at the same time, controlling it through a glute where most people's glutes are really inhibited and very weak. They rush in and out of their positions. Also, too, along with it, like from a force plate perspective as well, I can measure how inconsistent their forward moves are. And again, if that move's really inconsistent, let alone like, again, that's why I think so many guys do well with like a toe tap, a no stride, 2 strikes. What do we do? Like, why do so many people get wider? Why do so many, like it, again, from a force production and biomechanics side, it makes a lot of sense of like body control and why you can, like why with 2 strikes, like same reason, like why do we choke up? Like all the, like there's science behind reasoning behind why these things have worked for so long. But like, for example, one of the main reasons I like to work from launch is, and everybody has different definitions of launch up. Is it front heel up? Is it, big toe, like, on my 90% on my backside? Is it really 50-50? Is it really this and those other things? And that's where like, even like, insoles and like stuff like that as well. Like you can
Does
kind
it
of
feel like 50-50,
Yeah.
but it's actually not 50-50?
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. There's a difference between weight distribution and pressure distribution. Those are different things. They don't always align. Just because I have this much weight on my back foot doesn't mean I have the same amount of pressure. I could have my weight back, but my pressure forward. And that's again, in golf, it's very known in that same way of what that looks like, and how much pressure. And then also too, just because I'm creating pressure that way, is it creating the same amount of force? Now there's another layer that we're getting into. Okay, now you get all those things together. But a big thing that I do from launch is like, for example, if reciprocal torque, pattern like in a ground is like, you don't create a lot of force that way currently right now. Well, of course you're going to go to something else because you don't create force that way very well. So one of the main things I do, again, like the reason I start with reciprocal movement and a lot of those different ways of like drills and stuff that we do, it's like you will never move this way, and it will never be a good option for you because you literally can't create force that well this way. And because of that, like, again, you won't throw a punch this way because it's not going to work. Like it won't work. And like that's why some people ask me like, oh, like I had a coach at a Power 5 the other day like text me and they're like, what do you think about them doing like a kickback? I'm like, well, it's not that easy. Like you can't just be like, hey, like you should try a kickback. Like, like they probably, you might have them hit worse, but especially with watching how this athlete like creates force, because I'm probably predicting that it's probably very detrimental for you to do that. And again, if you're watching from my social media, you might be like, what? You said tell someone not to kick back? I was like, well, because it's not that simple. So if you're watching again, like, and I did, we talked about that in one podcast, it's like, if you're watching our content thinking like, oh, I'm just going to try a kickback and all of a sudden I'm going to be elite. Like, well, you missed it, on the first place. And also too, you're missing so many other things and you're just reductionist thinking. But the other big part is along with it is like, if I can teach you to have no momentum, right? And I can teach you to engage in the ground, how to use the ground with no way to compensate, with all these, constraining you where you have to create force this way. And then also I'm telling your brain that this spot is really important for me to get to. Like we practice this so much. Then when I get into like a forward move, I'm teaching the brain, I'm trying to, hey, get to your spot. Well, get to my spot. Well, what the hell is my spot? What does that even feel like? And also too, I only sometimes get there because how inconsistent my forward move is. So I actually start backwards. I start where we're 100, like every time we're trying to get to, and like within small variation within this bandwidth, I'm trying to get here. Then when we start doing striding, I feel like for me, it's a lot easier for me to teach the stride because when I say, hey, get to your spot, they know what their spot is. And then I blend
kind of that landmark already established.
And then I blend back and forth, right? Then I go, okay, launch, stride, launch, stride, get to your spot. Did you get to your spot? And because they know it in their head, they're like, nope. Oh, I didn't have slack pulled out. Oh, I didn't do these other things, right? And then also too, so crazy how I tell like these guys all the time. Let's say the guy's averaging like a 95 EV or something like that. Like, good for him, right? 95 EV. Then we go from launch and he's averaging 94. Like, how efficient is your forward move? Like, is that leg kick that you're doing to your ear? Is it really giving you what you think it's giving you? Like, if it's a power move for you, or you're doing this because you're trying to create some more power, like, bro, like you're creating 94 with a no stride, right? And again, along with that, like, what does your average look like then? You know, what do your angles look like? All these other things. And like, yeah, now you're hitting balls. Like, your ceiling is higher with this leg kick. Your max EV for sure. But the problem is the same thing too. Your basement is way lower, and your mishits are way more often, and you're slicing and you're cutting and your spacing's messed up and your direction's messed up. And it's like, great, you created all this force, but what did you compromise? You know, again, Robin, you know, Tom to feed Paul, whatever it is, right? It's like, you know, what did you compromise in that same mean part? So again, along with that though, now to say that though, I've had guys where starting with no flow, right? And again, just like me, I came up very similar in the same way as you. It's like smaller guy, foot down early, move the ball around, back control, all the, you know, like that type of philosophy. Where again, when I remember when I didn't have power, and one of the things I latched onto your stuff, it's very similar in that same way, was I started to move again and also get some natural moves that start coming out that really helped me hit, create some stretch dynamically to do some of these other things. And that was really powerful for me. Then I went too far off the deep end, right? And it was like more separation, more speed, more, you know, land more open, hit. So like, you know, and again, going those other things like along with it, where then also too, obviously, again, like was getting very draggy and was like just dragging my barrel constantly and had to cheat fastballs, was getting exposed by off speed, all this stuff. So then when I went to like Eugene stuff and started learning to get back across my body and like how to close that gap of separation, and that more isn't always better, and like, you know, like all these things.
Yeah, hitting has to be the primary goal.
Yeah.
So when people go too far with it, that's the tendencies, which is why people have problems with driveline, just screaming bat speed, bat speed, bat speed. Like if you're chasing bat speed without the context of hitting in games and being quick, like you can create more bat speed
direction.
The majority of the time when I see players chasing bat speed, they're creating longer swings.
Agreed.
That's my defense mechanism when people are like, oh, increase bat speed, or if Mookie Betts could increase his bat speed by 2 miles per hour, how much better could he be?
Yeah.
Like, well, how much worse could he be too?
For sure. You can't just one side.
You can't just say,
to your argument,
flip a switch and he's got 2 more miles an hour bat speed.
Yeah. Earlier, I think it connects right back to your argument earlier. The same thing of being like, he obviously has found an elite way to hit at that level where he's an MVP candidate almost every single year now.
Well, and then for his year in particular, not to, I don't know, pick on it, but he had 2 months this year where he went off.
Yeah.
So was his bat speed better in those months? And they were down, and was his bat speed lower in the months when he didn't hit?
I would bet.
Or was it the other way around?
I would bet, just because I had some information there a little back, I would bet before his MVP year, that his bat speeds were higher with that roll compared to him now with his little stick move that he does. But again, along with it, he lost bat speed. But at the same time, there's other things, like, for example, when I posted that Chewy kid that I posted the other day that me and you were just talking about yesterday, is when I posted him yesterday. This guy's like long, slow swing, right? And it's just like, well, long where, right? Long in the zone? Yep. Like slower than it could be? Yep. Like, does he mash? He's just like, this other thing as well. It's like, for example, and also too, he's using a massive fat barreled 34-inch bat, right? At 16 years old. And then you look at those things as well as like, again, like, sure, I can watch Mookie swing and be like long, or I could look at it and go short. There's where and when and in what area do I want him to have a short finish, like a Trout type finish? Do I want him to have more of a long Bellinger, but like is it in the zone and is it long this way on the outside of the zone? Is it long to get to the ball? Like where are we long? Right. And also contextually, like obviously it's very easy at any point on anybody's swing. I could say short, long, slow, fast. Again, at the same post, somebody will comment and be like, dude, what was his bat speed on that? He was blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, and that's, which is why the measuring, we get into all the measurement stuff of what's really happening. But I do think it's an interesting piece where, for example, like where I've had that mix where, and to be, straight with you in the same way as well. And I know that it's going to be opposite for you. I typically, especially with guys that are really athletic, I get like mix. Some of them are so athletic that they want to do things dynamically because they can compensate. It's very easy to be athletic and compensate. They can come up with, other ways to create the force if I let them move and I don't constrain it as much.
Mhm.
But I'm like, that's the exact reason I'm constraining it, because how you're trying to create force, that compensation is the problem, right? Like that is your biggest thing that helps you, but also your biggest hindrance, right? Your biggest deficiency is also tied to your biggest strength, right? So then if we really want to make this change, like I have to change that thing, and I have to constrain you not to be able to do that anymore, because that's what we're working on. Like that's what we were trying to change. And then on the opposite end of that, sometimes instead athletes that can't sequence and like CNS wise and all those things are big athletic guys, I'll get them to catch it more by I'll do something really athletic, right? Like, hey, we're going to do this very dynamic where I'm going to do like a reverse leg kick or something like that, which is pretty hard to do, especially then like, hey, I'm going to do a reverse leg kick off the machine. It's like, okay, like this is definitely something very different than what I've normally done, where I'm like picking up my back leg, up towards my chest and like literally like a reverse leg kick, like leg the other way and swinging the opposite way, right? And it's like that's very different for them and a very athletic thing to be able to control. And for some people, that's, like again, when I had Paige in here from like Oregon, or some of my pro guys that are just like really athletic. For example, like one thing when I used to work with Mariznik was he really liked like athletic things, like it would clean up a lot, but also at the same time, you're getting those other things. It's like, when he'd start doing it too much and just doing everything athletic, right? Or everything with movement, or what does athletic mean to you? A lot of things, would feed into a lot of compensations that he had, which is how he was making up for other forces, which is, some of the main things that we're trying to fix.
It's always balance. It's always a balance.
Yeah.
Regardless of whatever hitting approach you subscribe to.
Mm-hmm.
If you go too deep with it or go too far with it,
Mm-hmm.
just like who were we talking about earlier with JD?
Yep.
And going with the hockey stick move.
Yep.
He had to get away from something.
Yep.
With a bigger extreme of something else.
Yep.
And then you have success with that.
Yep.
And you go too deep with that. Now you're
Yep.
you're too far down that rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to come back. And
Yep.
and I was talking about with hitting, like we get the barrel, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of range on top and there's a lot of range on bottom that you can miss. To hit it square, it's such a small amount. So it's always that up, back and forth, up and down, left and right, like finding that neutral, that middle ground where you will excel. And that middle ground is going to be a little bit different for every player.
Mm-hmm.
But like to your point earlier about the 50-50 launch, whatever we call it, the truth, like hitters are going to move to that position.
Yeah.
So if you get to that position, one thing I like about the kickback and the feel of it is if you get to that position and everything turns left, you're spinning.
100%.
You're just spinning. Everything's just, as a righty, everything's turning left.
Yep.
So if you're trying to create direction,
Yep.
the shoulders have to move through. There's going to be a rotational move with the shoulders.
Yep.
If the hips are also going, there's no resistance, there's no tension, you're just spinning.
Yeah.
So that's just a really fundamental. I don't know how you would disagree with that type of topic. It's just get in the cage and feel it. If you feel your bat just coming straight around the ball, put a farm board on your back foot and see what you feel.
For sure.
At least experiment with it instead of just talking trash about it.
Well, and I think the other, piece like along with it is like one of the examples I give, I think that you'd really like with this is if you can't wrap your head around, like some people are like, yeah, but if I get there at the right time, it's all timing, kind of like what you're talking about. Like, yeah, I am turning left, but it's all timing. If I get there at the right time, who cares? Like, even more drive line, more baseball rebellion, more that way. It's like rotate, right? Some things that are also a talk with that is like a basic understanding of what that looks like. And contrary is like when we walk, our pelvis goes the opposite way as our upper body. Why is that so important? Well, if you try to walk with your right shoulder and your right hip and everything turning at the same time, you literally like zigzag back and forth. It's a big turn to your right, a big turn to your left, and you end up zigzagging and your direction is wild. But instead, when you walk and they counter each other, you walk straight with 2 different rotations.
Mhm.
They're countering each other to give me
There's
direction.
I just remembered, I gotta share an Instagram with you that I saw last night.
Oh,
And it was really cool. It was you'll end up reposting it, but it was a
Yeah.
kid that was hanging from a bar,
mhm.
and then a coach had a physio ball that the kid was like dolphin kicking, basically, like 2 legs kicking at
Oh,
the
I was
same
like,
time.
what's a dolphin kick?
So like both legs
Got
like
it.
kicking at the same time, but
Okay.
from a
Hanging.
hanging position.
Yeah.
And it was like a wave of
Mhm.
it was his lower body would kick, and as his butt was going back as his legs were kicking out, and
Yeah.
it was just this like wave of motion.
Yeah.
And it's a similar type deal where it's if you walk and it's the same
Same
it's
side.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Really funny feel.
Yeah.
And you would never do that
Mhm.
in competition. You would never run right arm forward, right leg forward.
100%.
It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And that's where I think that for the same thing of like within direction of love things, and also I mentioned this quite a bit, but I haven't mentioned to you directly. People are, again, one of the main things people push back when they're like bargaining, also like arguing, I think also in that same way is in some sense is like, I get it for righties, but not for lefties. Like I see a lot of righties do it, like, but it's different for lefties. Well, one of the things, obviously people mention it's a different game from each side of the plate. One, you're running a different direction. Two, on top of that as well, I'm mostly facing righties. On top of that as well, the lefties that I am facing, there is also a lot of soft ones, right, in comparison to righties. Also, from a righty, majority of the time, almost everything I'm going to see is breaking away from me. Everything is going away. Every breaking ball from a righty, all those other things, like, okay, great. Like, let's say I get some arm side run. Okay, you get the change up, sinker. You have some things that are moving that way. But in majority, every breaking ball that they're going to have, right, is going to be breaking. And also, too, why is it the number one thing in high school, youth, all the stuff? We throw fastballs away. It's one, because the pitcher can actually do it and locate it. But breaking balls are harder to locate, right, and get it for a strike consistently. Two, if you throw it down and away, like most hitters are going to have a direction problem. Like they can't cover that pitch. It also requires a lot from the body standpoint of how to get it to a hinge and how I need to rotate through those ranges of motion, actually be able to hit it for power and be able to hit it in the air. Again, most people don't have power opposite way. All these, you bring all these things together, like most righties are going to struggle with that pitch. It's going to be really hard, like down and away, up and in, right? But up and in, you get chances of hitting the guy, all this other stuff. Like, I mean, it's like, that's why that's like the number one pitch, in my opinion, like for that, the game there. But also, too, like lefties, so I would say righties have more of a direction focus. They have to have really good direction. If they don't have good direction as a righty, like you're going to be in trouble because you're not going to be able to cover majority of the pitches that you're going to get. Especially if the guy's not as good of a pitcher, like they're gonna live over there, just to, let you get yourself out, basically. Mm-hmm. As there's a reason there's also a lefty specialist and not a righty specialist. Lefty specialists always have a hard breaking ball or like a sweeping breaking ball. Lefties are also more concerned with spacing because everything is into them. Everything is breaking into how they're moving. So they can also get away with things, in my opinion, a lot more. One, from an anatomy standpoint, you look at like the asymmetries that are in our body and like where our organs and everything are positioned. I was talking about this with like DJ or push performance. Our bodies are actually more naturally, we can rotate more from the left side better than we can from the right, just from a asymmetry standpoint of like how our body's like positioned and like where our heart is. Like, we don't have a heart on each side of our body, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have every organ on both sides. We're not symmetrical when it comes into like how our organs put together and how our bodies put together. And so because of that and compression and what all that stuff looks like naturally, just as human beings, we can rotate more to our left side. One. Two, also on top of that as well, again, everything's breaking into me majority of my life, the same thing as well. And also two, a lot of righties don't, I think it's more likely for you to have cut than it is for you to have arm side or a good like two seam. I like to think of that, or a good sinker or any of those things. Most people are like around or they're dragging their arm, all those other things, which create, more cut with a lot of their balls. Or again, you're gonna get something straight. But I think also, again, as a lefty, like even their misses, like the breaking balls, like everything's going to be in. Where do you not throw lefties? Like down and in. Like we all know, we don't miss down and into a lefty, right? And then the lefty specialists, like they always have something that's breaking down to that corner. So it's actually funny when I used to pitch. One of the things that I would do is, again, with it, and a lot of people forget this, like I was actually more of a Division I pitcher than I was a hitter. like more recruited.
I didn't know that at
Yeah.
all.
So I was like a closer setup guy. I had a pretty good cutter because I didn't move my body very well, and so it naturally cut pretty good. And then I get slight cutter grip, and it was like pretty good, along with it. And then I had a breaking ball that I couldn't throw for a strike, but unless it was slow, but I threw it really hard, and people thought it was fastball, and I would just bury it like over and over again. But I pitched it differently from righty to lefties, kind of like a Mariano. Think of like I listened to how he would throw, and I found more success with righties. I would throw it down and away. Lefties, I would throw it more up and in. Interesting things where, again, when it comes into hitting, if it is a different task from each side of the plate because of the constraints are different, the angles are different, the pitch entries are different. The problem is different. And
what do you think if righties had to run to third base instead?
I've been asked that certain times. I think it's big for guys that are like more like slappy or like that's their game is how quickly can I get to first?
Do you think lefties build? I've thought about this a lot. I wish I wish Little League fields were the deepest in the corners and most shallow in center. Because I think when it's short in the corners, you try to hit pull side because it's the easiest way to hit a homer.
Yeah.
So it incentivizes pulling. I think it'd be really interesting if righties had to run a third, and lefties. I feel like that you don't want to roll over as a lefty because it's such a short throw from the second base.
So couldn't you for a thought experiment, if you looked at cricket, where they have to like run back and forth, I think is like a thought experiment there of like how I haven't studied enough lefty righty because they're more like over the top. They do that like big motion from over the top. I haven't, but again, you would think again, obviously with that like swinging wise, if they didn't have to run the ways that they do, I think more often, because I get asked that a lot, because a lot of people think like kickback for righties because they have to run to first. Why that, along with it. And I get like in the same sense, like, sure, like change your orientation where it's going to help you in that same way. But again, like, is that the reason righties are
force production? Is not running direction.
Guys trying to hit the ball first.
Cricket's different. So I met a guy, we did a thing in Birmingham this summer for the World Games. And there was a guy from Australia that does cricket.
The performance lab dude?
No, he was like a physical therapist that was there working. It was more random interaction.
Got it.
And the demos that he was doing, he was like, because they defend a wicket.
Yeah.
So they're not defending a strike zone.
Yeah, it's different.
Just like golf, the ball's on the ground. So the angles you're going to create are different. But it was a really interesting conversation with him. The developers that we have now, I had to explain the strike zone. Like what is an inside pitch? What is an outside pitch? What is pull? What is oppo?
Yeah.
To people that don't understand the game. It's super challenging. I think if you made like center field 180 feet and the corners were 200, and the kids could look out and be like, oh, if I hit over center field, I bet that would breed much better hitters consistently.
Yeah, definitely.
As a direction, they would want to hit the ball to the middle of the field.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of with that, I think it creates its own problems in the sense of it's kind of how a cage is in some sense, where cages are straight. So it's incentivized and all the coaches, everybody's like, drive it through the middle, drive it through the middle, drive it through the middle. Because hitting side nets, like people don't like to hit side nets, even though, just
unless you're hitting on hit tracks.
Yeah, it's just exactly. Like unless you can actually like see a field and like then you get the field back dynamic to it. But I mean I would foresee it being like everything else. Like every solution creates its own problem. And again, like along with it, are we now just pushing for direction because I only have to get it 190 feet or whatever, and like that's a homer. So it's just like everybody's just like I just got to hit it hard enough to center. So that's where like I think for example like when you put like any time a lot of people do a lot of the tennis ball throwing with all the your chuckets or any of that stuff, or there's even the one what's his name has that goes on the bat. A lot of times I see with that is like people start literally just like when some people sell out for quickness, they sell out for direction. And when you sell out for direction or hitting objects, like everybody's just like, oh, just put an object and hit it there. Like, yes, but at the same time, then they start cheating for that direction. Yep. And that causes its own problems. Like when it comes again, and what it can rob from spacing, it can rob from force production, it can rob from all these other things as well. And like there's a way of creating direction, without it being such a like handsy, pushy move that creates a lot of good direction. It's a valuable compensation that can really help in particular situations when I'm trying to purely get direction. It could be very valuable, but I think like, like anything else, it's like creates its own goods and bads, depending on what it looks like, I think would be from there. And like, I also think on the same sense of, it's an interesting piece. We talked about with some of the disagreement. I think it's interesting as well is foundationally. That's why I almost think it's like real conversations is like, it's what they always call it, like keyboard warriors or all these other things. Like people are more likely to write something and disagree than they are necessarily like disagree in person, especially when you're actually seeing all the other things from the other person as well. Like, you feel the intent, like you feel the love or passion or, much more respect or all those things that you can't necessarily get from written word, especially if you're not very talented at communicating through written word of like how the feelings you're having somebody else. That's like a unique, you know, way to communicate in the same way, or if it was just written word compared to like, I know some people that are really good at written word and really bad at talking on stage or, on social media they're this way. But if you read the written, like there's so many guys that are really good authors that would be terrible commentators or, whatever. It's a different way of communicating. So I do think it's like an interesting thing. We've talked about that as well, is like sometimes like some of these conversations were like, okay, we can disagree on things. And again, that same disagreement, like, or contextual argument that we're having, as well, could go a billion different ways if it was just written word or again, was on a thing and we didn't know each other and all those other, places compared to actually sitting down and having real conversations, like along with it. And I think it's an interesting there. And I want to kind of throw that kind of question back to you as well, of being like, how with that problem of what social media or what all these things have, gone, what is some of, we could keep identifying the problem. Okay, we get it. Like, okay, so again, we know that there's these problems here. Solution-based thinking, the same thing as well. What do you think is next? Because I don't think baseball just keeps going down that path necessarily. I mean, obviously it could and get worse and all these things, but at some point it almost gets so bad that it's like either people just stop talking, which is also not a solution. Like, it's not a solution to not communicate. It's like, okay, you and your wife keep getting into fights all the time. You're like, well, I'm just not going to talk to her then. It's like, it's not a solution, right? Like, it just creates even bigger separation. And at some point it comes to a head in the same way where like, we want to be in community. We want to do something like we're going to have these harder conversations, obviously at some point, and the same thing as well. So what do you think is well as like, where do you see that happening? And where do you see like maybe how the conversations change?